A piece of rotted wood pulled from the bottom of a well in Belgium. The Gallo-Roman Museum catalogued it in the 1930s, and then forgot it existed for 90 years. There are exactly 85 fragments recovered from 2 sites in this ancient city. 90 years of silence. Then one woman looked closer in 2020 and realized someone had thrown these tablets into that well on purpose. So what were they trying to hide? And why did the wood remember everything? The Roman Empire had a problem that every empire eventually faces: too much information, contracts, debts, land records, administrative orders, the names of high-ranking officials who were never supposed to appear in the historical record of a provincial backwater town. All of it written down, all of it dangerous. The Roman solution was elegant. They wrote on wax, thin wooden frames coated with a layer of beeswax called tabulae serratae. In Latin, you pressed a sharp iron stylus into the wax to write. When the document expired, when the contract was fulfilled, when the debt was paid, when the record became inconvenient, you simply smoothed the wax flat, gone reusable, untraceable except. The stylus sometimes pressed too hard. The tip bit through the wax and into the wood beneath, just slightly. Just enough to leave a ghost of the original text invisible to the naked eye, buried in the grain of the wood, indistinguishable from natural cracks and aging. The Romans did not know this. They threw the tablets in a well. They filled another batch into a muddy drainage ditch. They believed the information was destroyed. I kept coming back to one detail. 2,000 years later, under pandemic lockdown in 2020, a museum director named Els Hartog opened a storage box that had not been properly examined since 1930 and changed everything we thought we knew about Roman life at the edge of the empire. This is the story of the messages that refused to die. To understand why these tablets matter, you have to understand what Tongeren was. Not Rome, not Alexandria, not Carthage. Tongeren was a frontier town, a provincial administrative capital sitting near what is now the eastern border of Belgium, roughly 1947 kilometers northeast of modern Brussels. Founded as a military fort called Atuatuca Tungrorum around 10 BC, it served as the capital of the Civitas Tungrorum, an administrative district that covered much of what is now Belgium and parts of neighboring regions. It was, by Roman imperial standards, a secondary city, important enough to have a forum, important enough to have a temple complex, important enough to have an organized legal and administrative apparatus, but not important enough for Roman historians to write about extensively. And here is what nobody puts together: that invisibility was, for certain people, extremely useful. The tablets recovered from Tongeren date from the 1st to the early 3rd centuries AD, a span of roughly 200 years. During that period, the city suffered at least 3 major fires. It was rebuilt each time. Administration continued. Contracts were signed. Debts were recorded. Officials came and went. The tablets functioned as legal records, financial transaction documents, and official correspondence, objects at the center of Roman administrative life. Many of them were structured as triptychs, 3-panel legal documents used for contracts and official agreements. Roman law required such documents to be sealed and witnessed, a system introduced under Emperor Nero specifically to prevent fraud. This is significant. These were not personal letters. These were not informal notes. These were legally binding instruments, the kind of documents that, in the wrong hands, could prove a debt was unpaid, a property transfer was fraudulent, or a high-ranking official had authorized something he later denied authorizing. The best-preserved tablet was inscribed twice. On both front and back, the earlier text mentions lictors, bodyguards and public servants of Roman magistrates. The later inscription appears to refer to a legal act, possibly involving the removal of seals. The removal of seals on a document that was then thrown into a well, each step had a reasonable explanation. The legal validity had expired. The well was a convenient disposal point. The wax would dissolve. The wood would rot together. They formed something else. Simone in Roman Tongeren was systematically destroying the paper trail of power, not burning it. Burning leaves ash and evidence, drowning it in the dark at the bottom of a well where no one would ever look. The pattern reproduces itself. In 1930, archaeologists excavating a Roman settlement site in Tongeren near a temple complex pulled 73 wooden fragments from the soil. They looked at them, they noted them. They labeled them miscellaneous wood fragments, possible remains of boards or containers, and put them in storage. 73 pieces of the most significant Roman archive ever found in Northern Europe, filed under miscellaneous. Then in 2013, during a separate excavation, 12 more fragments were pulled from the bottom of a well near the ancient forum. Together, the 85 fragments formed what researchers now describe as an urban archive, providing direct access to everyday life and demonstrating that people were familiar with administration and writing from an early stage. But nobody connected the two groups, not in 2013, not in 2014, not for 7 more years. You have felt this before. The specific frustration of knowing something important is sitting right in front of you, labeled wrong, filed incorrectly, invisible not because it is hidden, but because nobody asked the right question. The papers in boxes in the attic that nobody has opened in decades. The photographs with names on the back that nobody alive can identify anymore. That is what happened here, but on an institutional scale across 90 years. The wood fragments were put in storage and forgotten until they were rediscovered by Els Hartog, director of the Gallo-Roman Museum Tongeren. In 2020, Hartog recognized their true significance and initiated a comprehensive re-examination. She contacted Professor Markus Scholes at Goethe University Frankfurt, a specialist in ancient inscriptions who had just made international headlines for deciphering the Frankfurt silver inscription, which proved that Christianity had spread north of the Alps. By the 3rd century AD, Scholes looked at the fragments and immediately understood why they had been dismissed. The wood was completely dried out, with its natural grain intact. Many tablets had been reused, the old wax stripped and new layers applied, leaving overlapping palimpsests of earlier writing. Actual handwriting was nearly indistinguishable from natural wood grain old cracks, and the damage of 2,000 years of burial. The timing is not subtle. 90 years passed between discovery and decipherment. The specific expertise needed to read these tablets, reflectance transformation imaging, multi-light scanning, chemical wax residue analysis, did not exist in 1930, it barely existed in 2013. Despite the pandemic, the team had to meet in person again and again to study the originals, always wearing face masks, each researcher presenting interim findings, which were then discussed and refined together, gradually yielding further insights. The wood had waited 1,800 years for someone with the right technology. Then it waited 90 more for someone to ask the right questions. Now here's the detail that I could not stop thinking about. The tablets came from 2 separate locations within the same ancient city, and the 2 groups tell completely different stories about why they were discarded. The second group of fragments came from a muddy depression that was apparently filled with worn-out tablets and other refuse to aid drainage. These texts included administrative copies, pupils' writing exercises, often the final use of already reused tablets, as well as a draft inscription intended for a statue of the future Emperor Caracalla, dating to 207 AD. That group makes sense. Old tablets worn out and reused to the point of illegibility, dumped into a drainage fill along with other rubbish. Routine disposal, nothing suspicious. But the first group, the tablets from the well near the forum and public buildings, tells a different story entirely. One assemblage was recovered from a well near the forum and other public buildings where the tablets appear to have been deliberately destroyed and discarded. Throwing them into the well likely ensured that the information they contained could no longer be read, perhaps an ancient form of data protection. Many of these pieces appear to have held contracts or official records where scribes deliberately applied strong pressure so that the writing would be deeply impressed into the wood. Read that again, scribes deliberately applied strong pressure. This is not accidental preservation. This is the opposite of accidental. Someone was writing these contracts with enough force to permanently mark the wood beneath the wax, creating, whether they intended to or not, a backup copy that could never be smoothed away, a shadowed document, a ghost record, and someone else later threw those same documents into a well. One tablet recovered from the well carries a date corresponding to AD 207. Another mentions Emperor Caracalla, placing it in the early 3rd century. The early 3rd century was a period of significant political instability in the Roman Empire, the beginning of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of military coups, civil wars, and provincial collapse that would eventually fracture the empire permanently, not coincidence, patterns. Someone in Tongeren in approximately AD 207 decided that certain contracts and official records needed to disappear, not be archived, not be transferred, disappear, into a well in pieces at night, because you do not throw official legal documents into a public well in daylight. The best preserved tablet mentioned lictors, the bodyguards and public servants of Roman magistrates, and appeared to refer to a legal act involving the removal of seals from a document that was then destroyed. This is where most people stop looking. They see old tablets thrown in a well and think routine disposal, but Roman law was precise about document destruction. Expired contracts were voided by specific legal procedures, not thrown into wells. The well disposal bypassed legal process entirely. Simone was not following procedure. Someone was erasing procedure itself. When Scholes and his team finally decoded what the wood had remembered, they found names, specific names, titles, references to individuals who had no business appearing in the administrative records of a small provincial city and who had never appeared in any other archaeological record from this region. The tablets record high-ranking officials that have rarely been recorded in northern provinces, and some proper names that have never been found before anywhere in the Roman archaeological record, never found before in any inscription, in any document, in any source from across the entire Roman Empire. Think about what that means. The Roman Empire lasted roughly 500 years in the West. It produced millions of inscriptions, thousands of papyri, hundreds of legal and administrative documents. The names of its officials, at every level, have been catalogued, cross-referenced, and studied for centuries. And yet here, in the bottom of a well in Belgium, were names that exist nowhere else. The texts preserved on the Tongeren tablets refer to debts, payments, property matters, and administrative procedures, the routine machinery of Roman provincial governance. But the presence of previously unrecorded high-ranking names within routine administrative documents suggests something specific. These were not the records of ordinary merchants or minor clerks. These were the records of people with significant power, people who preferred not to leave a documentary footprint in the official historical record. Your grandmother or your grandfather may have worked for someone like this, a local official, a landlord, a magistrate whose name never appeared in any newspaper, never in any public record, but whose decisions shaped entire communities for generations. The kind of power that operates through paperwork rather than proclamation. This kind of person exists. History just rarely preserves their names. The Romans understood this perfectly. Official stone inscriptions celebrated emperors and generals. The wax tablets, temporary, erasable, routinely destroyed, were where the real business happened. Unlike stone inscriptions, which often highlight elites, the Tongeren tablets document routine transactions and everyday governance. The wax was the shadow system. The permanent record was the curated myth, and then someone tried to erase the shadow system too. The wood remembers, even when we don't. Now here is where most people get this wrong. The popular version of this story, the version circulating across archaeology news sites since January 2026, frames this as a happy accident. Forgotten tablets rediscovered, messages decoded, history revealed. A clean, optimistic narrative of academic triumph. That framing misses the most disturbing part entirely. The tablets were not forgotten by accident. They were dismissed by design, not by any individual acting maliciously, but by a sequence of perfectly reasonable institutional decisions that together produced a 90-year gap in our understanding. In the 1930s, archaeologists identified the fragments as possible wood boards. Reasonable, the wax was gone, no writing was visible to the naked eye, and the excavation technology of the time could not detect stylus impressions in dried wood grain. Filing them as miscellaneous was the correct decision given available tools. In 2013, the second group was excavated and catalogued. But connecting two fragment groups from different excavation decades, different site contexts, and different storage locations required a specific kind of cross-institutional curiosity that academic archaeology, siloed by institution, by specialty, by publication timeline, does not naturally produce. Each step had a reasonable explanation. Together they form something else. But here is the twist that the optimistic version of this story never mentions. Of the 85 surviving fragments from two distinct archaeological contexts, at least 37 preserved traces of incised Latin text. That means 48 fragments, more than half, yielded nothing readable. Whatever was written on those tablets is gone forever. The stylus did not press hard enough. The wood did not survive intact enough. The information crossed the threshold of irreversibility that the original destroyers were counting on. We recovered 37 fragments worth of secrets. We lost 48, and those numbers apply only to the tablets that physically survived to be found. The tablets thrown deepest into the well or broken into pieces too small to recover, or dissolved entirely by groundwater, those were never counted at all. The ones that were not survivors, we have no idea how many there were. The ancient data destruction was more effective than the destroyers knew, and less effective than they intended. The pattern reproduces itself, even in the archaeology of its own erasure. 85 pieces of blackened wood now sit in the Gallo-Roman Museum of Tongeren Borgloon in eastern Belgium. Official archaeology calls them a significant provincial find, a rare window into Roman administrative life at the empire's northern edge. But if they are merely a routine administrative archive, why were they thrown into a well? Roman law had precise procedures for document disposal. None of those procedures involved dropping legal records into a public water source in pieces. The well disposal was not procedure, it was panic or calculation. And the names that survived in those wood grain impressions, names that appear nowhere else in the entire Roman archaeological record, suggest that whoever made that calculation had very specific reasons for not wanting those particular documents to outlast them. These are questions, and the answers may still be lying in fragments at the bottom of wells across every former Roman provincial city in northern Europe, in Belgium, in France, in Britain, in Germany, waiting for the next Elshartok to open the right storage box and ask the right questions. If the history they tried to erase is the history you came here to find, subscribe to Hidden Vestige and tell me in the comments, has anyone in your family ever mentioned finding something old? A document, a coin, a carved stone that nobody could explain or identify. Those stories matter more than most people realize. The fragments of erased history survive in memory long after the wood rots. This was Hidden Vestige. What history forgot we remember.